Welcome everyone to Fight Psychology. I am Lord Ranulfo Norreis, the Inside Draconis Armored Champion for like 6 more months or something like that. So I'm 33 now. When I was 23, I started doing competitive judo. And I realized that probably I should have been doing competitive fighting for a long time because I really enjoyed it. I've also done a fair amount of boxing throughout that time, although I've never really been like particularly aggressive about pursuing boxing, I guess, but I have done a lot of in-club sparring and like in-club tournaments or intra-club tournaments. But for judo, I did really try to be very competitive for quite a few years. And I went to a lot of like state and regional championships for my age and rank and stuff. And so I have a lot of tournament fighting background. And so it was actually pretty easy for me to transition over into the SCA kind of stuff. So I want to open up with just a couple quotes because I know people tend to talk a lot about how they don't feel particularly great about tournament fighting or stuff like that. And I just want you guys to know that even the best feel that way. So the first one is by Kyozo Mifune. He's a really famous judoka or a judo practitioner. He was a student of the guy who created judo. And I don't know if you might have seen it or you might not have, but there's a guy that there's like a video out there or whatever. And it's just like a really old guy doing judo. And he's throwing all of his students or whatever. And that guy actually is Kyozo Mifune. You know, he's pretty famous in judo circles. But he's talking in this quote about something that I will talk about a little bit later on. If you persist in one action or thought, your agility will be compromised and you will lose awareness of your surroundings. Something unexpected will occur and then you will be defeated. In all situations, you should have a free, adaptable, and calm spirit. And then the other one, and the one about whatever like weird psychological kind of situations we get ourselves into prior to tournaments or during tournaments, it happens to everybody, but you can't overcome it. And this is Mike Tyson, obviously very famous, not really like the world's greatest person, obviously, but definitely somebody who fought at the highest levels in his sport for a long time and does have something to say about that. And this is a really good quote. It's actually, you can find it on YouTube. And it's from a documentary that was done about him. And he's talking about how he feels prior to a match, and especially how he feels in training camp. And he says, I'm afraid of everything. I'm afraid of losing. I'm afraid of being humiliated. I think this man might be capable of beating me, but once I'm in the ring, I'm a god, you know, and he goes into it a little bit more, and we'll talk about it some later on as well. But essentially what he's trying to get across is like, yes, of course, he's super worried prior to that, and I think that happens to all of us. But once he gets into the ring, he has to put all that aside. So I made this next section, the steps of fighting. This is the order that I think of them. You guys may find that you do it in a slightly different way because I really don't have a lot of anticipation, either positive or negative, for a fight. Really, until I get pretty close to it, actually. I mean, within like a week or two of it. Everything prior to that, I really have no opinion, either positive or negative, about the tournament. I generally just try not to think about it too much, other than that, like, I'm getting prepared for this thing that will happen in the future. So I think if fighting is starting out with preparation, phasing kind of into an anticipatory phase. When that's for me, usually like the week or two before a tournament or whatever, where I do start to be like, oh, this is really coming up. Then the actual execution phase, and then the aftermath. And the aftermath is really critical to talk about because it happens to all of us. And I think the aftermath of fighting factors into how we anticipate our fights, whether we're positive or negative about them. So that's kind of what I'm going to lead into here as we move through this. I do think that sometimes people can get really anticipatory, I guess, either in like a positive sense or negative sense, well before they start preparing. And then you would really just flip those two things around. All right. So training, can everyone still see the slides? All right, cool. Looks good. Awesome. Thanks. So training. So just the first thing I want to open up with on training is a quote from Muhammad Ali. Again, obviously a guy who is really the best that ever was at his time, and a lot of people think is the best that ever was, period, in boxing. And he just says, in terms of physical training, the fight is won or lost far away from witnesses, behind the lines, in the gym, and out there on the road, long before I dance under those lights. And when it comes to tournament fighting, I don't think that truer words have ever been spoken. Your success or your failure, you know, in the tournament will 100% come down to how much preparation you put into it. And of course, the thing to bear in mind is the other person is putting a lot of preparation into it as well. But, you know, how you perform is up to you. And we'll talk about that some more too. The more physical preparation you do, the more confident you're going to feel before and during the fight. During the anticipatory phase, where you're starting to get a little worried or a little excited, if you feel that you've prepared well, that will help you through it. And of course, during the fight, if you feel that you prepared well, you'll be able to put your concerns about it out of your head much more easily. One thing that a coach told me once, and that I've always kept with me, is you can only come to a fight with the training that you actually did. Fighting isn't something you can cram for. So if you feel like you've got a tournament coming up, you know, tomorrow night, obviously, or next week, it's kind of late to start preparing for it at that point. You really need to have started. I would strongly suggest at least a couple of months beforehand. That's what I've always done. If I only get like 8 weeks of fight prep in, I feel like I haven't really done my due diligence. That's me personally. I would always try to get in like 12 weeks or more if I could. But the important part is, and so this is both a positive and a negative. The positive obviously is that, like, if you have worked really, really hard and you've prepared a lot, you know, you'll feel very confident about it. But the flip side of it is if you haven't, don't beat yourself up over it either. You can't go back and change it. You know, you can only show up to the fight with the training that you did. You might have to sort of reset your expectations a little bit, but that's also a good thing to do too, to be like realistic about what you're expecting to achieve, you know, confident, but realistic. And so please don't take that as like a negative, you know, like, oh, you didn't do 16 weeks of fight camp prior to this tournament. Do you even care? You know, I don't think that. I think that however much training you do is probably however much training you really could find time to devote to it. And that when you go into the tournament, or you're just before the tournament in the days leading up to it, you know, just be realistic with yourself, accept that you've done all the training that you can do, and you have fun, you know. Like I say, if you guys have questions, you want me to repeat anything or like approach something from a different way, just let me know. Okay, that's chatting. All right. So the next part of training, so there's obviously the physical aspect of training, which is really important. But what I really want to talk about today is the mental aspect of training and fighting. And so mentally, some of the things that I do to try and get prepared for an event, and this was a little bit easier in judo because every judo match or tournament location is pretty samey. Generally, they're big warehouses and they have mats laid out. Even if I don't like perfectly visualize what it actually looks like, I'm pretty close enough. I'm close enough to fool my own self into thinking I've already been there. With the SCA, it's a little bit different because a lot of our events are in like different cool places, just out in the fields or a wood somewhere, something like that. So it does help to have been to a place beforehand. But over the last 10 years, I started out as a really terrible visualizer, and I've gotten to be really pretty good at it, in my own opinion, over the last decade. So I can always, at least at a minimum, visualize, you know, a grassy list field. You know, that's not too hard. And so what I like to do is to visualize the event location. You know, sometimes when I'm just doing other stuff, and I visualize success at that location, whatever success might mean to me. When I was first starting out doing SCA stuff, I wasn't really planning on winning, you know, right out of the, or I wasn't expecting to win right out of the gate. Yeah, I always plan to win, but I'm also realistic about what might actually happen. And so, you know, I visualize success at that location. Like if success for me is like, hey, I want to go 50-50, you know, or I want to beat one person, whatever that may be, I visualize that. And generally I try to visualize a little bit more too. You know, if realistically I'm like, hey, I think I'm probably going to, you know, make it through the first round. That's a good goal for me. I might be like, okay, well, that's good to visualize, but I also want to visualize making it to this through the second round, you know? And I know it might seem a little bit silly because it's sort of just like psychologically giving yourself a big up, you know, that maybe you might feel you haven't really earned, but it is genuinely helpful. And the highest levels of actual athletic competition in the world, I mean, they encourage athletes to do this. Like, you know, Usain Bolt, visualize yourself running a 9-second 100-meter or whatever, you know, he might never actually do it, but it's good to visualize that kind of success. It really like, it gets your brain prepared to win, you know, and to not try and hold you back. And it also gets your body prepared to accomplish these things. So visualize success at that location, visualize your victory, you know, don't, you know, like maybe Yannick is going to beat me like a redheaded stepchild or whatever, you know, left, right, and Sunday. But maybe that's what's really going to happen. But I don't ever want to visualize that. I always want to visualize my success, my victory, you know, because once you start being negative in your visualization, you can kind of spiral. You don't want to do that. The next one, passive and active meditation. This is really key. And this is what has made me really good at just like emptying my mind in a fight. So there's passive meditation, and I'm going to stop sharing here for a second because I want you guys to see or whatnot. So like there's passive meditation, right? And that's, I think, what we think about when we think about like Buddhist monks standing around and chanting ohms and mantras and stuff like that, or sitting around in lotus position. And I'm a proponent of that. Like I do a fair amount of passive meditation where I just sit around and try to focus on my breathing and stuff like that, you know. But I also do a lot of what I call active meditation, and I got that from some guru or something somewhere, you know. There's guys that talk about it, guys and gals or whatever. And active meditation is doing stuff while not thinking about doing stuff. And so for me, the easiest way to do that is running, because I hate running. And so I genuinely try not to think about anything while I'm running, because the only things I will think about are how much it sucks. And so over time, it has become very easy for me to do that. Like when I'm running, it is so easy for me to just immediately drop into this mode where the only thing I'm thinking about are like the next 2 steps. And then it's not very far from that to just not really thinking about anything at all, you know. And I can run like a couple miles and literally have had no thoughts, you know. I don't know if that's great. I might actually be kind of dumb, but it is super useful for getting in the right mindset to be successful at tournament fighting. And so running might not be the same thing for you. I mean, I've known people who were like swimmers and they could do that. I've known people who just could like do that. I've known people who said they could just do that around the house. Like they would just be vacuuming or whatever and just totally like blank their mind out. I think it's a really fantastic skill to have, because it makes it super easy for me to like to flip a switch almost while I'm fighting. So like right before not even the tournament, but just the fights themselves start, like I can be like chit chatting and happy and hugging or whatever, or just like talking around, having a drink or whatever with you guys and everyone else at the tournament. But as soon as I get into the actual list field, I've really kind of stopped thinking about a whole lot. You know, I might think a little bit about what my opponent is using, you know, what their stance is and stuff like that. But it's very easy to go from that kind of like minimal thought mode to just not really a reactive mode, but a very like open to experience mode, open to whatever occurs in the fight. I'm not going to be like pre-programmed. I'm not going to have chess matched my fight out a whole bunch, you know? So active meditation. And the other thing I like about it is if you are doing it while you're working out or whatever, you get 2 benefits, you know, you get the physical benefit and the mental benefit. So it's great. If you do passive meditation, which I also still think is really good too, you are just kind of sitting around. So if you're like me and you don't have a whole lot of free time, because we're all grown adults with jobs and stuff, it's good to try and like get 2 things for free. All right, so let me go back to sharing the screen. That's the one. All right, cool. And then just another quote again from Muhammad Ali. It kind of relates to everything that we've talked about. What you're thinking is what you're becoming. And so I know that we all get it. I get it. Everybody gets it. You start to think that you're not good enough, or you start to think that you're not performing well enough or whatever. And I just encourage you, I think all of you guys, everyone who shows up on the field is great just for showing up, and I think everyone else on the field thinks along the same lines that I do. So no one is out there judging you. And if you can, and I know it's hard because our thoughts aren't something that we always really have control over, try and not let yourself think that you're bad, because unfortunately you can wind up in like a really negative spiral where that actually does make you perform worse. All right, slide number 5. We're over halfway through, everyone. All right, so anticipation, this is the next phase. And so anticipation can be both positive and negative. So the positive is what makes you want to participate in a controlled fight environment, because that is what we're doing. I mean, obviously we're not having any real fights. I've never been in a real fight because I genuinely have been in enough like controlled boxing and judo matches that I have no interest in ever being in a real fight. It's plenty bad enough getting punched in the mouth by a dude with a glove. I don't need to experience it in real life. Some of you may have been in real fights or whatever, and you know that there is a great difference between what we do and what that is. So it's always a controlled fight environment that we're engaged in, and it's something that we choose to do. So there's some anticipatory element that makes us want to do this, whatever that might be. I mean, for me, it really is just a love of fighting. I have kind of like a philosophy of it or whatever, where I genuinely view what we do as a martial art. And one of the things that I like about martial arts is that it's transient. Anytime that we're out there fighting with someone else, we're making an artwork that the only other person who will ever fully appreciate it is the person we're fighting. There are people on the sidelines and stuff like that who can appreciate some elements of it, but the only other person who will ever fully appreciate what we've created together is the other person. And I always think that's really cool. But so there's that positive element, but there's also a negative element to anticipation, and that is what you fear about participating in a controlled fight environment. And I can tell you honestly that I have both aspects of this at all times. I can say that you almost certainly do as well. I mean, I won't 100% say for everyone on earth, but I'm pretty confident that they do. They have a reason that they want to do it, and they have things that they're afraid of about it. And for me, I think like a lot of people, the things that we're afraid of are probably very similar. Just to go back to the original slide, will it hurt? Will I be embarrassed? Will everyone laugh at me or whatever? Will I not perform up to my expectations? Stuff like that. I mean, these are all anticipatory elements. We get worried about them. Sometimes we let them get in our head, and they're negative ones. And I think that by following through on my kind of like empty your mind approach, it can really help you get rid of those negative anticipatory effects before you go into the actual fight match that you're about to do. So anywho, moving on to execution. So for execution, what I really want to talk about, and what I think of as execution, is probably the part right around when the court right before the actual tournament is winding up, if you're doing a crown or a coronet or whatever, or otherwise, if it's just sort of like kind of a lower key tournament or whatever, generally like the warm-up phase. Once the warm-ups are starting to wind down and the clock is ticking and it's about to start, I think we hit what I think of as the execution phase, which is really when a lot of the worries start to disappear no matter what, because our adrenaline has hit. And so adrenaline is a kind of a catch-all term. Obviously, there's actually a number of hormones that are involved in that process. But what I really want people to think about is everything that you feel is really normal. It happens to basically all mammals, more or less. We all wind up with these same hormonal cascades anytime that we feel that we're going into a stress environment. And I mean, I love fighting. I really do. But it is a stress environment, you know. I feel like I love fighting and SCA fighting a lot, and I can't imagine not having that stress response, you know. And so I would just be amazed if there are people out there that just don't have that at all. Maybe there are, and then they probably don't really need this chat. But if you're not one of those people, you will definitely have an adrenaline hormonal cascade. And what that results in is the fight, flight, freeze response. And the thing about it is, and what makes controlled fighting interesting, is that there's really only one response that you can have, even though your body or your mind might sort of natively encourage you to have a different one. You're about to go into a fight, you have to fight, especially once you actually get into the ring. I mean, obviously you can quit or walk away or whatever, and there would be no shame in that if you felt like you needed to. But in general, you're kind of locked into this one path, right? And so for a lot of people, that may not be the natural response that they would have in any other situation. I mean, a lot of people might be prone to flee, or they might be prone to freeze. And in fact, actually, as I was making this, I was thinking about that's one of the reasons that we do the authorization process, is just to make sure that in a controlled environment that is actually very safe, a person doesn't just automatically let their flight or their freeze response take over completely. You know, they don't freeze up entirely while they're just getting battered in the armor, and they don't run away. You know, we want to make sure that they can at least defend themselves in some fashion, obviously, and that is the fight response. And so, like I say, by forcing yourself to fight, you might be overcoming your instinctive reaction. Like I said, I've never actually been in a real, like, for real street fight or anything like that. Thankfully, I'm pretty happy about that. I've never been shot at. I've never gone to war, even though I'm in the military or anything like that. So I really don't actually know what my instinctive reaction would be in one of those situations. So I might be overcoming it too. I don't know. I think a lot of us are probably in kind of the same boat, or maybe we're not. Maybe you guys are all like super badasses. But anyways, that's just one of the things I want to talk about as far as execution. That's going to happen. You're going to get that hormonal response or whatever. And what you really need to be able to do is control it, channel it, and not let it cloud your thoughts, basically. There's probably like a Sith Jedi reference I could have thrown in there if I had thought about it. But I also wanted to leave a quote here too. And for people that maybe are worried, or that hormonal response and that anticipation causes them to be concerned that they're not going to they're not going to measure up on the field. And this is from Geoffrey de Charny. I'm probably butchering it because it's old French. But he was a very famous 14th century knight. He was the first knight of the Order of the Star, which the French king made to compete with the Order of the Garter and stuff like this. And he wrote a book called The Knight's Own Book of Chivalry. And in it, very early on, it's on like the second or third page or whatever, he says, "For I maintain that there are no small feats of arms, but only great and good ones." And I really believe that to my core. Everyone who gets out on the field, no matter what, is doing something very impressive. You know, everyone that I've ever fought in a judo tournament, even the people that I like totally tooled in 10 seconds, was doing something super impressive just by being there, you know? And I guarantee you there's somebody floating around somewhere who's thinking about me as that dude that they just ruined in like 10 seconds too. So we all went through that phase no matter what. And like I say, I very much agree with him. Everything that we do out there is something to be proud of. And I think getting that mindset going will really help you clear your mind later on. Because during the execution, we should be optimally, in my opinion, and sometimes people might disagree, in what I think of as the combat mindset. And so I believe that there is someone out there who can like chess match out a moving like SCA fight or a boxing match or whatever, like 15 or 30 seconds in advance, or even just 5, which would be an amazing skill. Where, you know, I'm going to do this and then they're going to do that. And then I'm going to do this and they're going to do that. And I'm going to do this and they're going to do that. And then I'm going to beat them or whatever, you know. Like, I'm not saying that that person doesn't exist, but I think a lot of us are not that person. So I find that this is a much better way to approach these things if you're not quite so unbelievably analytical. The combat mind. You can't be tense. You have to be relaxed. And that means both physically relaxed and mentally relaxed. You know, if you start to tense up or get real worried or whatever, that will affect your performance. And there are different ways that you can approach handling that kind of worry. Obviously, I think it's really good if you have been working your meditation, both active and passive, prior to. That'll really help you. But otherwise, so I was talking to a guy at one point, and he mentioned this concept, and it was, I'm going to let my thoughts pass like leaves in a river. And I'm sure he stole that from some like smarter person or whatever. But at any rate, it was pretty good for me. And sometimes I visualize that. Like if I get worried about stuff prior to a fight or whatever, sometimes I do kind of visualize it as like, okay, my mind is this river, and these negative thoughts are like these leaves covering this river or whatever, or like gunk in this river or whatnot. And it will go away if I just let it. You know, if I like focus on it too much or try to move it further along, it's just going to swirl all around like a leaf actually would, and maybe not actually clear out of this river, you know. And that's like super helpful for me. Maybe it will help you guys or whatnot, but rather than like fighting these negative thoughts, I try to just let them like be and go away. So that's one thing. Not tense but relaxed, not planning but flexible. And that's really how I do. I really don't plan a whole lot in a match, but I am very flexible to whatever occurs. And so, like I say, or as you can see on the slide, it's okay to have a plan. I think we do. I'm not saying that I don't. I'm just saying I don't plan very far in advance. But you have to be prepared for it to change within milliseconds, basically. Whatever your plan is, the other person is going to do some stuff, and they're probably going to throw your plan off. And you have to be prepared and ready, and not so committed to your course of action that you can't respond to what has happened, you know. And again, a Mike Tyson quote here, which I think is really great. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, you know, which I can tell you from personal experience is very true. You have a plan and then you get punched in the mouth and your plan goes out the window, you know. And so our sport is a little bit different in that you're only going to get punched in the mouth once, basically. You know, one hit is enough to kill or to really throw off your game. I mean, you're going to wind up on your knees, or you're going to wind up down an arm that you probably would prefer to have, you know. And so it's not so much the getting punched in the mouth aspect in our game, but just everybody has a plan until the other guy does something different, you know, other guy or other woman or, you know, other person of whatever gender orientation or whatnot. Whatever the case may be, you can do as much, you can plan, but it's going to change and you have to be ready for that. And so I really encourage people, don't go in there and be like, I'm going to throw, you know, a leg shot, and then I'm going to turn that into an offside head wrap, and then or an offside head shot, and then I'm going to throw a wrap to the head or something like that. Because I guarantee you the fight picture will have changed so much by the time you're in between that leg shot and the offside head shot that may not be a good plan anymore, you know, unless you're just really beating up on somebody who's totally new. I really think that is the situation. So the other thing is not thinking, but deeply focused. And this is probably like the one that people might struggle with the most. You can't really have any thoughts, or at least I don't, and I have a pretty empty head, so it might be easy for me. But you do have to be very focused on what you're doing. I mean, it can be the only thing you're focused on. And what I like to talk about is if you think about like boxers or maybe actually football players is probably a good example here. So they're doing their thing and they're in the middle of tens of thousands of screaming fans, you know, and they have to tune all that out. And that's really tough. You know, I mean, I've never been in that environment or whatever, but I mean, I've just been in an environment where like the other guy's coach is yelling at him and your coach is yelling at you and they've got a little cheering section and you've got a little cheering section, you know, and that is plenty of noise already, believe me. And you have to tune it all out. You even have to tune out a little bit of what your coach is saying until he tells you something really relevant to your situation right then, you know. And that's a skill that it takes a while to develop, to not think, to tune everything else out except for exactly what you're doing right at that time. And again, that's why I really am a proponent of active meditation, because for me, running is just the perfect way to do that. I don't really think about anything except for exactly what I'm doing right now. Like I said, if I look any further into the future, like the next 100 yards or whatever, I'm going to hate life, you know. So the next thing too is not self-critical, but confident. So going back to the training aspect where I was talking about, you know, you can only show up to the fight with the training that you did. Another thing to bear in mind when you're at the fight is I've done as much training as I could do. And, you know, I think we all have to be honest with ourselves too. That might not be true. I've sat around on the couch sometimes when I could have been out training or should have been out training. But the time to think about that is not right before the match. The time to have your like Maoist self-critique session or whatever is after everything is over. And then you can go back and look at your plan and all that kind of stuff and be like, well, maybe I could have worked out a little bit more. Or I could have done some more technique work at the Pell, or I could have traveled to another practice once or twice or something like that. But the time to not think about that stuff is right before the match, because then you'll get really self-critical and you will screw up your game plan or your game. So not self-critical, but confident. You've done as much as you could do. You're going to perform the best that you can, you know, and that's really the mindset to be in my opinion. So the next slide is the aftermath. So this obviously hits us all, the physical effects. I get the shakes really terrible. So like when I get done fighting or whatever, like it's kind of hard to describe, but I just have to like stand around and do this. I don't know if you guys can see because I'm sharing the screen, but I'm just like wiggling my fingers and like clench and unclench my fists a bunch and stuff like that. Because my hands get all shaky. And that's just like the aftermath. That's the coming down off of the adrenaline, basically. And it happens to everybody. I mean, maybe not the shakes necessarily, but some aspect of a physical response. People can get kind of numb. You can be obviously super exhausted, but you can expect, one thing I like to talk about here is that you can be more exhausted than you think you should be. And that in and of itself is normal. Hunger, you can be super hungry. Myself, I tend to actually be really not very hungry at all after I've fought. It usually takes a few hours for like my system to kick back in. And then there's also the emotional effects. And again, I think this happens to everybody, like anger at a loss, joy at a victory. And I think one thing too that happens sometimes are what we might think rationally are inappropriate emotions. Like, I just won. Why am I angry? And the reason for that I like to tell people, and the real reason is adrenaline. You've had a bunch of hormones running through your system all at once. It's okay. Don't feel bad about it. You know, just let the emotions process, basically. And if you do this, it helps the anticipatory phase prior to, because you're not all like worried and afraid and concerned, like, oh, I'm going to have inappropriate emotions or whatever. I mean, you know, obviously try not to like lash out at people for no reason or whatever. But by the same token, don't judge yourself in advance because you're worried like, oh no, I'm going to win and I'm going to be angry, or I'm not going to do as well as I thought I would. And I'm going to be super sad, like more sad than I think I should be. That's okay. It happens to everybody. Don't like preemptively beat yourself up over it, because again, that kind of stuff is what clouds your mind during the actual fight. Ennui is another big one. I have that. I don't really get like anger, joy, sadness. I get ennui really bad after a match. Like, why am I doing this? Why am I here? Uh, and then, 20 or 30 minutes later, I'm like, oh, duh, I'm here because I love this. But it's just like my weird emotional reaction, I guess. So it happens to everybody. So that really kind of wraps it up for me. Like I said, I really encourage you to get in a mindset of I guess what I want to say is the number one slide that I would recommend if you remember nothing else from this is the combat mind slide, because that's really the best possible way to be during a fight. Not tense, but relaxed, not planning, but flexible, not thinking, but deeply focused, And just as like some recommended reading, obviously there's the Desharney book, Knight's Own Book of Chivalry. I really think that's really good because obviously here's a guy, I mean, this guy died on the battlefield, like he fought a lot and he thought a lot about chivalry and about, what it means to fight and be a knight and all this kind of stuff. And he starts his book out by saying basically like, hey, if you're trying, you're on the right path already, if you're doing deeds of arms, even if you think they're small, even if it's just as much as like, hey, you know what? I'm going to sit in front of my couch and buckle on my helmet because I feel like I could use some more helmet time. And I'm going to sit here and watch some TV while I've got my helmet on to get used to it. That's something. You're on the right path, and you should be proud of what you're doing. And of course, continue to make steps, but don't beat yourself up for not doing enough, So that's really good. If you don't listen to anything I say, listen to something the real knight said, read his book. Another one, and so a lot of what I think about is like the right mental mindset and the way to meditate and the way to like do active meditation and stuff like that comes from this book. It's called Gold Medal Mental Workout for Combat Sports. It's by this Polish guy. He's like a sports psychologist, which is a real job that you can have. I did not know that until I read this book. But so he's like a sports psychologist. He's worked with tons and tons of like Olympic medal athletes, mostly from like former Soviet Union states, but also, with Westerners as well. And his book is just fantastic. The only problem is it's out of print. And so a lot of the copies go for like $100 or more, which is not great. However, if you are creative, you can find a copy for cheaper. And that's all I'll say about that. And then the next one is The Book of Five Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. Again, a guy who spent most of his life fighting, and he has a lot of thoughts about exactly like what the right kind of mindset to have is. And a lot of what I think is just basically cribbed out of his book. So you could have skipped this whole entire presentation had you read his book first. And then because I'm a judo guy, I always have to shill Jigoro Kano. He's the founder of judo, and he wrote a book called Mind Over Muscle. It is really good. It's very much about the benefits of not trying to necessarily like overpower someone or your opponent or whatever, but to really outthink them by reacting and counter reacting or forcing them to react or whatever to whatever it is that's going on in the fight. And it's pretty good. That's about half of it. The other half is really about how great judo is and how Japan kind of got screwed in World War II. Obviously, he's a Japanese guy. That's his personal opinion. But the back half of the book is really pretty good. And it's pretty cheap too. So don't feel like you got boned or whatever, because half of the book is sort of boring. That's really it. I do have other recommended reading, but I didn't want to like fill this slide up or whatnot. But if anybody has any questions, now is the time to ask. I see the chat has really been blowing up. So let me stop sharing.